The man on your $10 bill has a secret. Alexander Hamilton, founding father, American hero, and the architect of the greatest debt scheme in human history. His decision in 1790 created a $38 trillion monster that grows by $3.3 billion every day. Economists say it's unstoppable. Politicians say it's under control. They're both lying. Today, we'll reveal how Hamilton's blessing became America's curse and why the crash is inevitable. We'll walk through all of U.S. history, from Hamilton to Donald Trump, to understand how they created and inflated the debt bubble that, if it bursts, will destroy the economies of the U.S. and the world. 1789. The United States of America is only 13 years old. The young republic won the War of Independence, but the price of freedom was colossal debt. $77 million, an astronomical sum for those times, more than the country's entire annual income. The 13 states owed $25 million, the federal government another $52 million. Creditors were diverse: the French government, Dutch bankers, Spanish merchants, even ordinary American farmers who had sold provisions to Washington's army for promissory notes. Many believed the young country should default, simply not pay, start with a clean slate. This was a popular idea among ordinary citizens who saw no point in repaying European bankers. But then a man stepped onto the stage who would forever change American financial philosophy: Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. His face is the one you can see every day when you pull a $10 bill from your pocket. During the War of Independence, Hamilton was Washington's aide-de-camp, and after the war, he became one of the chief architects of the American Constitution, and he had a revolutionary plan. On January 14, 1790, Hamilton presented to Congress his first report on public credit, a 40,000-word document that shocked his contemporaries. His idea was simple and radical at the same time. The federal government should not only pay its debts in full, but also assume all the states' debts. A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing, Hamilton wrote. This phrase became his famous quote and his curse. Hamilton believed that debt creates a bond between the government and creditors. If wealthy people and banks own government bonds, they're invested in the country's success. They'll support the government because their own well-being depends on its solvency. But most importantly, Hamilton saw debt as a tool to finance wars, build infrastructure, and develop the economy. A country without debt is a country without creditworthiness. Hamilton's plan sparked fierce debates. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison strongly opposed it. They saw it as a conspiracy favoring wealthy Northerners who had previously bought up debt certificates from poor Southerners at discounted prices. But Hamilton was adamant. If the government chooses whom to pay and whom not to pay, it destroys trust, he argued. A contract is a contract. No matter who now holds the paper, the U.S. must pay all debts. After months of political battles, the plan was adopted. On in July 1790, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison made a deal. Hamilton would get his debt plan, and the Southerners would get a new capital on the Potomac River, future Washington. Thus was born the American national debt, and it was born not from desperation, but by design, as a deliberate strategy. By 1791, the federal government had taken on $75 million in debt, and importantly, Hamilton didn't plan to pay it off quickly. He wanted permanent but controlled debt that could be refinanced, but not necessarily fully repaid. Jefferson called this a moral crime against future generations. Today, we know he was right, but not quite in the way he thought. For the first 140 years of U.S. existence, debt rose and fell in waves. Each war brought a sharp spike. Each peacetime period, attempts at repayment. The War of 1812 against Britain raised the debt to $127 million. Then, under President Andrew Jackson, something incredible happened.
In 1835, U.S. national debt was completely paid off, the only time in history. Jackson hated debt with religious fervor. He called it a national curse and moral evil. He sold public lands, cut spending to the minimum, and in 1835 declared, "The national debt is fully paid." But his triumph lasted just over a year. Then the financial panic of 1837 began, and the debt returned. Jackson died in 1845, never having seen America debt-free. The Civil War of 1861 to 1865 became the first real debt explosion. To finance the war against the Confederacy, President Lincoln and Congress did what was previously unthinkable. They issued an enormous quantity of government bonds. By the end of the war, debt reached $2.7 billion, 40 times more than before the war. Each American owed $75 in debt. At that time, this was a skilled worker's annual salary. But even after this, the debt remained manageable. Why? Because an unspoken rule existed. Debt could be increased only during wartime, and it must be paid down in peacetime. By 1916, despite 50 years of economic and population growth, the debt was only $1.2 billion. America kept its promise. Peacetime is debt repayment time. But World War I struck. The U.S. entered conflict in 1917, and in 2 years, the debt soared to $27 billion. Then began an attempt to return to the old rules. In the 1920s, under Republican Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, the debt was reduced to $16 billion by 1929. It seemed the old system worked. America still followed the principle, borrow only for critical needs, repay in peacetime. The country still controlled its finances. And then the Great Depression hit, and everything changed forever. 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes office as president. The country is in ruins, 25% unemployment, thousands of bankrupt banks and businesses, millions starving. Roosevelt brought a revolutionary idea. The government must spend money to save the economy, even if it doesn't have that money, even if it has to borrow. Thus was born the New Deal, a grand program of government spending. Roosevelt created dozens of new agencies, hiring millions of unemployed to build infrastructure. The price was enormous. By 1936, debt reached $34 billion, more than doubling in 3 peacetime years. Conservatives were outraged. Roosevelt is eating up our children's future. He's turning America into a socialist state. But then World War II came, and everything before that seemed like child's play. The U.S. entered the war in December 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 4 years of war, the government spent $296 billion, more than all government spending in the entire previous history of the country combined. How was this financed? With debt. Colossal debt. The Treasury Department, under Henry Morgenthau, organized 8 massive campaigns to sell war bonds. Hollywood stars traveled the country urging people to buy victory bonds. Children collected change to buy war stamps. By the war's end in 1945, debt reached an incredible $260 billion, nearly 120% of the country's GDP. This was an absolute record that held for decades. Essentially, each American owed an annual salary. But most importantly, Roosevelt broke the old rule. Now it was normal to borrow not only during wartime, but also in peacetime, for economic development, for social programs, for whatever the government deemed important. Debt ceased to be a temporary evil. It became a permanent management tool. After 1945, during the Cold War, America got a chance to return to fiscal discipline, and it partially succeeded. Under Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, debt remained at approximately $250 to $270 billion. It didn't grow in absolute numbers, but the economy grew faster. So debt as a percentage of GDP fell from 119% to 53%. This was the golden age of the American economy. High growth rates, rising wages, a strong middle class, and relatively stable government finances. But beneath the surface, new problems were growing. The Cold War demanded enormous military spending. The arms race with the USSR meant constant spending on nuclear weapons, missiles, submarines, military bases around the world.
Under Eisenhower, military spending constituted 50 to 60% of the federal budget. Eisenhower himself was a general and understood the danger coming from defense contractors and politicians interested in constantly growing military budgets. He warned, "We must guard against the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex." But he was ignored. Then came Lyndon Johnson, and the madness began. Johnson dreamed of creating the Great Society, an ambitious system of social programs that would eradicate poverty and inequality in America. In 1965, he launched Medicare and Medicaid, government health insurance for the elderly and poor, the War on Poverty program, food stamp distribution, housing subsidies, educational grants. At the same time, he was waging war in Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1968, the U.S. sent 500,000 soldiers into the jungles of Southeast Asia. The war cost $25 billion a year. By the end of Johnson's presidency in 1969, debt had grown to $353 billion. Inflation was accelerating. Budget deficits became a permanent phenomenon. But worst of all, programs were created that cannot be eliminated. Medicare and Medicaid won't disappear even when there's no money. These programs grow automatically without congressional decisions. Johnson created a machine that would consume money for decades and which would become the main cause of today's debt crisis. And if Hamilton created the precedent on permanent debt itself, President Johnson turned American national debt into a time bomb. Today, the social programs created by Lyndon Johnson consume more than 40% of all American debt. The scale of this government spending shocks you? Keep watching. The craziest part is ahead. 1981, Ronald Reagan becomes president with a promise to balance the budget and reduce debt. He said, "Government debt is moral bankruptcy. We're stealing from our children and grandchildren." But by the end of his presidency in 1989, the debt had tripled from $900 billion to $2.7 trillion. What happened? Reagan believed in supply-side economics, the theory that tax cuts would lead to such rapid economic growth that government revenues would increase despite lower rates. In 1981, he signed the largest tax cut in history. Rates for the wealthy fell from 70% to 28%. Corporate taxes dropped sharply. About 20 million new jobs were created, and American family incomes grew. But nevertheless, his theory didn't work. The economy grew, but federal government revenues continued to fall. But spending didn't fall. Reagan promised to shrink government, but in reality he expanded it. The military budget soared. Reagan wanted to win the Cold War, and he spared no expense. On the SDI Star Wars program, on new aircraft carriers, on nuclear arsenal modernization, military spending grew from 5% of GDP to 6.5%. Social programs also grew, although Reagan tried to cut them. Congress, controlled by Democrats, blocked every attempt to cut Medicare or Social Security. As a result, Reagan got budget deficits of $200 billion a year, unprecedented figures for peacetime. But most cynically of all, Reagan knew what he was doing. His advisor, Martin Anderson, later revealed Reagan understood that deficits were inevitable, but he consciously chose them. The logic was simple. Let the debt grow now so that later Democrats won't be able to spend on their social programs because there will be no money. But this didn't work. Democrats simply learned to live on debt. By the late 1980s, U.S. debt became the fastest growing in the developed world. America transformed from the largest creditor into the planet's largest debtor, and nobody cared. In the early 1990s, it seemed everything could be fixed. George H.W. Bush, breaking his promise of no new taxes, agreed to raise taxes in 1990. He lost the election because of this, but the move helped balance the budget. Then came Bill Clinton, and a miracle happened. By the late 1990s, the economy was booming. The dot bubble drove stock prices sky high. Tax revenues soared to a record 20% of GDP, higher than ever in U.S. history. From 1998 to 2001, the U.S. had a budget surplus for the first time in 30 years. The government not only stopped taking on new debt, but began paying down old debt. Public debt fell from $3.8 trillion to $3.4 trillion. In 4 years, $450 billion was paid down, the first debt reduction since 1969. This was a triumph of fiscal discipline. It seemed the problem was solved. Alan Greenspan, Fed chairman, even worried, what if we pay off all the debt? Wouldn't that be bad for financial markets? These worries were premature. In 2001, George W. Bush arrived, and everything collapsed again. Bush started with massive tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. The reasoning was simple. The government has a surplus, so it's taking too much in taxes, need to return money to the people. But the surplus instantly disappeared. Soon, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. In 2003, invasion of Iraq. 2 wars simultaneously, both without exit plans. The cost of these wars totaled over $6 trillion. They were completely financed by debt. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit. Bank crashes, bailout packages, economic collapse. By the end of Bush's presidency in 2009, debt reached $11.9 trillion. In 8 years, it doubled. Barack Obama came into the wreckage of the economy. Unemployment 10%, recession, auto industry collapse. Obama responded with massive government spending.
A $787 billion stimulus package saving General Motors and Chrysler, expanding Medicaid health insurance. And his main legacy, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, an ambitious attempt to provide health insurance to all Americans. Obamacare's cost is estimated at $1.5 trillion over 10 years. Another massive program that's impossible to eliminate. By the end of Obama's presidency in 2017, debt had grown to $20 trillion, nearly doubled again. Obama defended himself. I inherited a crisis I had to spend to save the economy. Partly true, but deficits continued even after the economy recovered. Then came Donald Trump and showed that all previous presidents were amateurs. Trump promised to eliminate the debt in 8 years.
Hillary Clinton called you the king of debt. Well, no, she didn't call me. I called myself the king of debt. I'm the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I've made a fortune by using debt.
Instead, he added $8 trillion in 4 years, the largest increase under any single-term president in history. How? First, another massive tax cut in 2017, totaling $1.9 trillion. The corporate tax rate fell from 35% to 21%. They promised this would lead to an explosion of investment and growth. Growth was modest, and the deficit soared. Even before the pandemic in 2019, with a growing economy and low unemployment, the deficit was $1 trillion a year. Then came COVID-19 and absolute chaos began. In March 2020, Trump and Congress passed a $2.2 trillion stimulus package, $1,200 checks to every American, small business loans, extended unemployment benefits. In December 2020, another $900 billion. In March 2021, already under Joe Biden, another $1.9 trillion. In 2 years, the government pumped over $5 trillion of emergency spending into the economy, all on debt. By the end of 2021, debt exceeded $30 trillion. For the first time, Biden signed gigantic bills, a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, a $280 billion CHIPS Act, a $750 billion Climate Act. By October 2025, debt exceeded $38 trillion. That's more than the economy of all European Union countries combined. Look at how the speed of debt growth is increasing. In 2000, the government added $150 billion of debt per year. In 2010, $1 trillion per year. In 2020, $3 trillion per year. In 2024, nearly $2 trillion per year, even without a crisis. The government spends money like a drunk at a bar.
interest payments reached $1.2 trillion per year, or $3.3 billion per day. That's more than the U.S. spends on defense, more than on Medicare. Soon, it will be the largest budget item. Many think U.S. debt has been growing for 80 years. So what? Why should now be different? Because the math has changed. Previously, rates were low, around 2%. The government borrowed almost for free. But after COVID-19, the Fed raised them to 5%. Now, new borrowing and refinancing old debt costs much more. Every year, the U.S. rolls over about a third of the debt, and soon almost all debt will be at high rates. In the future, a day will come when almost the entire country's budget will go to paying interest. In parallel, a demographic crisis is approaching. America's population is rapidly aging. Spending on Social Security and Medicare will soon exceed half the budget. Bottom line, deficits will grow even if politicians want to economize. In 30 years, American debt could reach $200 trillion. That's more than global GDP. Such debt is mathematically impossible to service. But the collapse of the debt system could happen at any moment. We're already in the turbulent zone. When a country can't pay its debts, there are several scenarios, and all are bad. Scenario 1, debt monetization. The Fed prints money to buy bonds. Works temporarily, but leads to inflation and dollar collapse. Money loses value. The middle class disappears. The world stops trusting the dollar. The U.S. loses financial leadership. Scenario 2, default. The U.S. declares it cannot repay debt. Markets crash. Pension funds and insurance companies lose trillions. Borrowing rates skyrocket. The budget is cut by 30 to 40%. Government workers, military, retirees, no payments. Scenario 3, draconian austerity. The U.S. decides to act to stabilize debt. They need to eliminate the $2 trillion annual deficit, double all taxes, and cut all spending by 85%. Politically impossible. Scenario 4, slow weakening. Most likely scenario, debt grows, interest payments choke the budget, money goes to pensions and health care while infrastructure and military power weaken. America gradually loses competitive advantage to China and other powers. This has already begun. Bridges need repair. Transportation lags behind Asia and Europe. Schools show the worst results among developed countries. Not collapse, but slow loss of position. So $38 trillion of debt. This is not an abstraction. This is your children's and grandchildren's future. They will be the ones paying for everything. Math never lies. Sooner or later, the bill will have to be paid. The question is when, and who will be in power when the music stops.